For years, she stood quietly in the background, loyal, composed, and unwavering. But behind the calm dignity of Duchess Sophie lived a secret so powerful, so controversial, it had been deliberately buried. Until now. Because what Queen Elizabeth left exclusively to her wasn't just a gift, it was a decision. A decision that would quietly bypass Camilla. And when Sophie finally broke her silence, the truth threatened to expose a royal divide far deeper than anyone ever imagined. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Duchess Sophie had never demanded attention. She never chased it, never manipulated her way toward it, and never allowed herself to become the center of royal drama. Instead, she existed in a space that few truly understood, a space defined not by ambition, but by quiet endurance. For decades, she served with a kind of loyalty that did not seek applause. While others carried titles that echoed louder in headlines, Sophie carried something far more dangerous: the Queen's unwavering trust. It was a trust that had been built slowly, carefully, and invisibly, strengthened in moments the public would never see, and conversations no one would ever hear. She became known inside palace walls as someone who could be relied upon without question, someone who did not bend under pressure, someone who did not betray confidence, and perhaps most importantly, someone who never asked for more than she was given. Yet outside those walls, her quiet strength was often mistaken for insignificance. While Camilla's presence grew beside King Charles, becoming more visible, more formalized, and more central to the monarchy's public image, Sophie remained in the shadows. The cameras followed Camilla. The narratives elevated Camilla. The institution appeared to shape itself around Camilla's rising position, and in that carefully managed spotlight, Sophie became easy to overlook, easy to underestimate, easy to forget. But what few understood was that Sophie's power was never rooted in visibility. It was rooted in proximity, emotional proximity, the kind that could not be manufactured, only earned. Because while Camilla stood beside the throne in public, Sophie stood beside the Queen in private. As Queen Elizabeth entered the final chapter of her reign, something began to shift. Those closest to her noticed it first, not in grand announcements, but in quiet adjustments. Her schedule became more selective, her meetings more intentional, and within those private moments, Sophie's presence became increasingly consistent. She was invited into conversations others were not part of. She was granted time others were not given. And it was not because of her title, it was because of what she represented: stability, loyalty, emotional safety. The Queen, who had spent a lifetime carrying the unbearable weight of duty, had grown cautious of those who viewed proximity to her as power. But Sophie never did. Sophie remained constant, predictable, safe. Palace insiders would later recall how these private meetings carried a tone that felt different, more reflective, more personal, less about the institution and more about legacy. Sophie would enter those rooms quietly and leave just as quietly, offering no clues, no explanations, and no indication of what had been discussed. She did not confide in anyone. She did not seek reassurance. She carried herself with the same composed restraint she had always maintained. But those who observed closely sensed something beneath the surface, something unspoken, something irreversible. Because the Queen, who had spent her entire life safeguarding the continuity of the crown, was now safeguarding something else entirely, something deeply personal. And Sophie, despite knowing the weight of what was unfolding, said nothing. She did not attempt to secure her place in the narrative. She did not attempt to reshape perception. She allowed the world to continue believing what it wanted to believe, that her role was secondary, that her presence was merely supportive. But her silence was never emptiness. It was protection, protection of a moment, protection of a promise, protection of a decision that had been made not out of obligation, but out of absolute certainty. Because Sophie understood something others did not, that what the Queen had entrusted to her was not meant to be explained, it was meant to be preserved. And as the Queen's final months quietly slipped into history, the truth remained buried beneath layers of tradition, expectation, and assumption. Camilla's position appeared secure. The monarchy's structure appeared intact. The world moved forward, unaware that something profound had already shifted, unaware that a decision had been made in silence that would one day challenge everything people believed about loyalty, succession, and trust. And Sophie, the one person at the center of it all, carried that truth without hesitation, without fear, and without revealing what it meant. Because behind closed doors, while the world believed Camilla's position was secure, Queen Elizabeth was quietly shaping a legacy that would place Sophie at the center of a deeply personal and irreversible choice. In her final years, Queen Elizabeth did turn to power. She turned to trust. And surprisingly, it wasn't Camilla who earned her deepest confidence. It was Sophie. Their conversations stretched late into the evening, far beyond official duties. What they shared wasn't political. It was personal. And somewhere within those private exchanges, a promise was made, one so profound that it would forever separate Sophie's place in the Queen's heart from everyone else. The Queen had spent a lifetime surrounded by people who needed something from her. Advice, approval, authority. Loyalty was expected, but sincerity was rare. And over time, the difference between the two became painfully clear. As age slowly reshaped her world and losses carved deeper emotional absences, Queen Elizabeth became more selective with her trust. She no longer relied on proximity or position to determine who stood closest to her. She relied on emotional truth. And in that deeply personal recalibration, Sophie emerged not as the loudest voice, but as the safest one. She did not approach the Queen as a monarch. She approached her as a person. That distinction changed everything. The passing of Prince Philip created a silence inside the Queen that few could reach. It was not simply the loss of a husband. It was the loss of the one person who had stood beside her through every moment of uncertainty, every burden of leadership, every private doubt hidden beneath public strength. The grief was not theatrical. It was quiet, heavy, permanent. And in those moments, when even the strongest public figure felt fragile in private, Sophie did not offer solutions. She offered presence. She did not attempt to fill the void. She simply refused to leave it unattended. She listened without interruption. She understood without ever asking for it. She became essential. There were days when Sophie's presence was the only constant allowed near the Queen. Days when the noise of duty was kept at a distance, and only emotional truth was permitted inside those private walls. Palace staff noticed it, not because it was announced, but because it was consistent. Sophie was not summoned for ceremony. She was welcome. For comfort. The Queen spoke to her not as a sovereign addressing a subject, but as someone confronting the quiet reality of time, legacy, and loss. And Sophie never betrayed that vulnerability. She never turned those moments into influence. She protected them. That protection became the foundation of something far more powerful than authority. It became trust in its purest form. What made Sophie different was not ambition, but restraint. She never positioned herself to gain advantage. She never attempted to shape perception. She never used emotional proximity to elevate her standing. And the Queen, who had seen the subtle calculations of royal life unfold for decades, recognized that difference immediately. Sophie did not serve the crown to become closer to it. She served because she believed in preserving what it represented. She protected the institution without attempting to control it. And in doing so, she offered the Queen something she could not find elsewhere: emotional safety without expectation. In contrast, Camilla's role had evolved into something defined by structure and responsibility. Her position beside King Charles was visible, formal, and necessary to the monarchy's public continuity. But emotional trust did not always follow public visibility. Camilla's relationship with the Queen carried respect, but it did not carry the same quiet intimacy. It did not carry the same shared silence. And the Queen, who understood the difference between duty and emotional refuge, knew exactly where her heart felt safest. It was not about hierarchy, it was about truth. As the Queen reflected on everything she had built, everything she had protected, and everything she would eventually leave behind, she understood that legacy was not sustained by titles alone. It was sustained by people, by those who would preserve its emotional meaning long after the ceremony's end. And in Sophie, she saw someone who would never exploit what she was given, someone who would never reshape it for personal gain, someone who would carry it with the same quiet dignity she herself had lived by. And it was within this rare and unbreakable trust that Queen Elizabeth made a choice no one outside those private walls was ever meant to discover. There were no cameras, no official records, no witnesses, just the Queen and Sophie. In one quiet moment, something was passed, something not listed in public inventories, something never mentioned in official statements. It wasn't announced because it wasn't meant to be. But years later, whispers would confirm what truly happened in that room and why Camilla was never meant to receive what Sophie now held. By that point, Queen Elizabeth understood that time was no longer an endless horizon. It had become something more fragile, more finite. Every decision she made carried weight far beyond its immediate moment. And yet, what she prepared to do with Sophie was not part of royal protocol. It was not reviewed, debated, or approved by advisors. It was arranged quietly, deliberately, and without explanation. The meeting itself appeared ordinary from the outside. Sophie had been invited before, after all. Her presence never raised suspicion, but this time, something felt different. The invitation came with a stillness that could not be explained. No schedule adjustments were announced. No aides were positioned nearby. The space was left intentionally private, completely undisturbed. When Sophie entered, she did so without expectation. She had grown accustomed to these personal conversations, these quiet moments where the Queen allowed herself to exist beyond duty. But this meeting carried an emotional gravity that Sophie immediately sensed. The Queen was calm, but her calm carried finality. Her words were measured, intentional. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty in her purpose. She was not seeking advice, she was making a decision. And Sophie, for perhaps the first time, realized she was not there to listen. She was there to receive. What passed between them was never described publicly. No official confirmation ever acknowledged it. But those closest to Sophie would later recall the subtle shift that followed. She did not emerge triumphant. She emerged burdened. Her composure remained intact, but something behind it had changed. She carried herself with deeper restraint, as though she now understood a truth that could not be shared. Her silence became heavier, more deliberate. It was not the silence of someone excluded, it was the silence of someone entrusted. Because what the Queen gave her was never meant to elevate her position in the public eye. It was not a symbol of rank. It was not an endorsement meant for ceremony. It was personal, intimate, permanent. It was the Queen's way of placing something deeply meaningful into the hands of someone she believed would protect it, not because she had to, but because she would never betray it. Sophie understood this instantly. She did not question it. She did not resist it. But she felt its weight. She understood that what had just happened would remain invisible to the world, yet impossible to undo. And while nothing outwardly changed in the days that followed, the emotional reality had shifted forever. Palace staff sensed it, even if they could not explain it. Sophie's loyalty had always been unwavering, but now it carried a new dimension, a quiet certainty. She was no longer simply serving the Queen's legacy. She was safeguarding a part of it that existed beyond public knowledge, beyond ceremony, beyond institutional structure. The Queen had not followed expectation. She had followed instinct. And in doing so, had created a reality no one else had anticipated. What made this moment so profound was not what had been given, but why it had been given. This was not about reward. It was about belief. The Queen had made a final judgment, not based on obligation, not based on hierarchy, but based on emotional truth. She had chosen Sophie because she trusted her to carry something others might misunderstand, exploit, or challenge. And Sophie, bound by loyalty and love, accepted that responsibility without question. But what Sophie received wasn't merely personal, it was a message that would redefine loyalty, trust, and the Queen's final intentions. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't random, it was deliberate, because Queen Elizabeth understood the weight of every decision she made. And choosing Sophie wasn't about preference, it was about legacy, about who she believed would protect something far greater than titles or status. And when insiders began connecting the pieces, one painful truth emerged. The Queen's final trust did not rest where everyone expected it to. By the time that private transfer had taken place, Queen Elizabeth had already spent decades observing those closest to her, not just how they behaved in public, but how they carried themselves in private, when there was nothing to gain and everything to reveal. She had witnessed ambition disguised as loyalty. She had seen proximity mistaken for entitlement. And she had learned, often painfully, that titles could elevate a person's status, but they could never guarantee the integrity of their intentions. Sophie had never confused access with authority. She had never attempted to reshape her place within the institution. She remained constant, grounded, and emotionally steady even when circumstances shifted around her. That quiet consistency did not go unnoticed. In fact, it became the very reason the Queen trusted her more deeply than anyone realized. The monarchy, for Queen Elizabeth, was never simply a system of inheritance. It was a fragile emotional structure built on sacrifice, restraint, and responsibility. She understood that its survival depended not just on ceremony, but on the character of those who would carry it forward. And in Sophie, she saw a reflection of values that had defined her own reign: discipline without arrogance, loyalty without expectation, strength without display. Sophie did not seek validation. She did not manipulate perception. She existed within the institution without attempting to control it. And that distinction mattered more than anyone outside those private walls could ever fully understand. Camilla's path, by contrast, had been shaped by complexity and public scrutiny. Her presence beside Charles had been both controversial and transformative. Over time, she had secured her place through endurance and acceptance, navigating an unforgiving public narrative with determination, but emotional acceptance and institutional necessity were not always the same thing. The Queen respected Camilla's resilience, but her trust operated on a different level entirely. It was not measured by endurance alone. It was measured by emotional alignment, by who understood the deeper meaning of what the monarchy represented beyond its public function. And in those quiet moments of reflection, the Queen recognized that Sophie embodied that understanding without ever needing it explained. What made this realization so powerful was its simplicity. Sophie did not represent change. She carried herself with the same quiet discipline the Queen had lived by for her entire reign. She understood the emotional cost of service. She understood that true loyalty required silence, not recognition. And perhaps most importantly, she understood that protecting the monarchy sometimes meant protecting its most personal truths, even when doing so required sacrifice. The Queen did not need Sophie to lead publicly. She needed her to preserve privately, to carry something invisible yet essential. And this decision, once made, could never be undone. It existed beyond public announcement, beyond formal acknowledgement, beyond correction. It was final because it was personal. But decisions of this magnitude rarely remain hidden forever. Subtle shifts began to emerge. Unspoken realizations quietly formed. Those closest to the Queen began to sense that something had changed in ways they could not fully articulate. Sophie's presence carried new weight, new meaning, and although nothing had been declared openly, the emotional truth had already taken root. Because within the monarchy, silence can conceal more than words ever reveal. And eventually, even the most carefully protected truths begin to surface not through confirmation, but through realization. And when the truth finally began to surface, the emotional consequences inside the palace became impossible to ignore. It didn't come from an announcement. It came from a realization, subtle at first, almost invisible. But then, undeniable, something had changed. Sophie held something she hadn't before, and those closest to the Queen knew it. Questions began forming behind closed doors, questions no one dared ask publicly, because confirming the truth would mean confronting a decision that could never be undone. In the days following the Queen's passing, the palace became a place defined by controlled grief and disciplined composure. Every movement was measured, every word was chosen carefully. The monarchy had endured loss before, and it knew how to protect its image. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, something quieter and far more unsettling had begun to unfold. It wasn't spoken aloud. It wasn't formally acknowledged. It existed in the subtle shifts of human behavior, In the way people looked at Sophie, in the way conversations paused when she entered a room, in the way certain individuals suddenly seemed unsure of what she now represented. Those who had spent years observing royal dynamics were the first to notice it. Sophie's presence had always been respected, but now it carried a different kind of gravity. Not authority, not command, something deeper, something emotional. It wasn't something she displayed openly, but it surrounded her nonetheless. She remained composed, exactly as she always had. She did not alter her behavior. She did not assert herself differently. And yet, something had undeniably changed. It was not Sophie herself that was different. It was what she now carried, the invisible consequence of the Queen's final trust. Senior members of the royal household began piecing together fragments of understanding without ever speaking them aloud. Private interactions became more cautious. Conversations became more guarded. No one asked direct questions, but the silence itself became a form of inquiry. Because in a family where protocol governed nearly everything, deviation from expectation did not go unnoticed. And Sophie, despite her efforts to remain exactly as she had always been, now existed at the center of something no one could fully explain, but everyone could feel. The tension revealed itself most clearly in moments of quiet gathering. Private family conversations carried an emotional undercurrent that had not existed before. Sophie never referenced what had happened. She never attempted to define it. She allowed others to arrive at their own conclusions. But conclusions were inevitable, because emotional truth has a way of revealing itself, even when protected by silence. Those closest to the Queen knew her patterns. They knew her instincts. And slowly, without confirmation, they began to understand that the Queen had made a final decision that existed outside the boundaries of expectation. What made this realization so powerful was its permanence. This was not something that could be revised or reframed. It was not subject to negotiation. It existed because the Queen had willed it into existence, and her absence ensured it would remain untouched. Sophie's silence only reinforced its significance. She was not hiding it out of fear. She was protecting it out of loyalty. And that distinction made it impossible to challenge her without challenging the Queen herself. But within the monarchy, emotional truths rarely remain contained forever. Awareness spreads quietly, carried not through declarations, but through understanding. And as more members of the royal family began to grasp what had taken place, the emotional consequences became unavoidable, because this was never simply about what had been given. It was about what had been chosen. And more importantly, about who had not been chosen. For Camilla, that realization would carry its own weight, one shaped not by confrontation, but by absence. Because eventually, silence could no longer protect a secret that was already beginning to reshape the monarchy itself. It wasn't announced, but Camilla knew. Somehow, she knew. Perhaps it was Sophie's quiet confidence, or perhaps it was something missing, something she expected, but never received. And in that realization came a devastating truth. The Queen had made a choice, a deeply personal choice, one that could not be challenged, reversed, or ignored. And for Camilla, it marked a moment that would forever redefine her place in the Queen's private legacy. At first, the realization did not arrive as a clear answer. It came as a feeling, a subtle absence that lingered where certainty had once lived. Camilla had spent years navigating her way into acceptance, enduring public scrutiny, enduring rejection, enduring the emotional distance that had separated her from the institution she now stood beside. She had believed, perhaps not consciously but emotionally, that time had resolved those fractures. That loyalty, persistence, and quiet endurance had earned her a place not just within the monarchy's structure, but within the Queen's personal trust. And yet, something now suggested otherwise, something final, something undeniable. It wasn't Sophie's behavior that revealed it. Sophie remained exactly as she had always been, respectful, composed, unwavering in her restraint. She did not assert new authority. She did not shift her tone. But emotional realities do not require announcement. They reveal themselves in silence, in the way certain conversations no longer unfolded the same way, in the way the emotional balance inside the royal family had quietly adjusted itself. Camilla, who had learned to read those invisible dynamics over decades, understood what others were only beginning to suspect. The Queen had drawn a line before her passing, and that line had not been drawn around rank. It had been drawn around trust. For Camilla, the pain was not rooted in public humiliation. There was no scandal, no exposure, no declaration that could be defended or challenged. The pain existed in something far more difficult to confront, the realization that emotional decisions cannot be negotiated. They cannot be reshaped through logic or explained through protocol. They exist because they are felt. And the Queen had felt something with Sophie that she had never extended in the same way to Camilla. That truth, though invisible, carried enormous weight. There were moments, brief and subtle, where the emotional tension became impossible to ignore, not confrontational, not hostile, but present. Camilla remained dignified, as she always had. She did not question Sophie. She did not demand explanation, because doing so would have required acknowledging something that neither of them had spoken aloud. Sophie, for her part, never allowed herself to appear elevated by what had happened. She did not use the Queen's final trust as leverage. In fact, her restraint only reinforced its authenticity. She carried it not as power, but as responsibility, and that quiet acceptance made it even harder for Camilla to dismiss its significance. What made the situation so emotionally complex was that there was no villain, no betrayal in the traditional sense. The Queen had acted according to her own emotional truth. Sophie had accepted it with loyalty, and Camilla, despite her own pain, understood that some decisions exist beyond fairness. They exist beyond justification. They exist because they reflect the deepest instincts of the human heart, and those instincts, once acted upon, cannot be undone. But silence, no matter how carefully maintained, has limits. The emotional consequences of the Queen's choice had begun to ripple outward, shaping relationships, altering perceptions, and redefining roles in ways that could not remain hidden forever. Sophie had never sought recognition. She had never intended to reveal what had happened. She had accepted it as something private, something sacred, something meant to remain between herself and the Queen alone. Yet the monarchy itself was shifting around that truth. Awareness was growing. Emotional realities were colliding with institutional expectations. And Sophie, who had protected the Queen's final decision with unwavering devotion, would soon face a moment she had never wanted a moment, where silence would no longer be enough to contain what had already begun to change everything. Because Sophie had never intended to reveal the truth, but circumstances would soon force her to break the silence she had protected for so long. For years, she said nothing. She carried the Queen's final trust quietly, faithfully. But silence has weight, and eventually, that weight became impossible to bear. When Sophie finally spoke, it wasn't to claim power, it was to honor the Queen's voice. And what she revealed confirmed everything insiders had long suspected. The Queen had chosen her, personally, deliberately, and forever. The decision to speak did not come easily. Sophie had spent years protecting something she believed was never meant for public interpretation. She had accepted the Queen's final trust with humility, never allowing herself to view it as elevation. To her, it was not an advantage. It was a responsibility, and responsibility, especially one rooted in emotional loyalty, does not demand recognition. It demands restraint. But as time passed, the emotional tension surrounding the truth grew heavier. It lived in the silence between conversations. It lived in the quiet assumptions others began to form. And most painfully, it lived in the misunderstanding of the Queen's intentions. Sophie had never feared the truth itself. What she feared was the distortion of its meaning, because what the Queen had given her was never about rank, and never about exclusion. It was about preservation. It was about ensuring that something deeply personal would remain in the hands of someone who would never misuse it. Sophie understood that speaking about it could risk transforming something sacred into something political. And that was never what the Queen had wanted. For a long time, Sophie convinced herself that silence was the only way to honor that trust. But silence, she would eventually realize, was allowing others to interpret the Queen's intentions without understanding them. The moment she chose to speak was not dramatic. It was deeply emotional, private, reluctant. Those closest to her would later recall the quiet gravity in her voice, the careful way she chose her words, and the unmistakable emotional weight behind them. She did not speak as someone claiming victory. She spoke as someone fulfilling a promise. She explained that the Queen had not acted out of favoritism. She had acted out of emotional certainty. She had made a decision not based on hierarchy, but on belief. Belief in Sophie's ability to protect something intangible, something fragile, something irreplaceable. Sophie made it clear that she had never viewed herself as superior to anyone else, especially not Camilla. Her relationship with the Queen had been built not on competition, but on understanding. And the Queen's final gesture had not changed who Sophie was. It had only deepened her obligation to remain exactly the person the Queen had trusted. She did not want acknowledgement. She wanted clarity. She wanted the Queen's final decision to be understood not as a disruption, but as a continuation of the values she had lived by for her entire reign. What made Sophie's revelation so powerful was its sincerity. She did not embellish it. She did not use it to elevate herself. She spoke with humility, emphasizing that what she had received was not a privilege, but a duty. And in doing so, she reshaped how those around her understood the Queen's final choice. It was no longer viewed as a mystery driven by secrecy. It became recognized as an act driven by trust, pure, emotional trust. For many, the revelation did not create division. It created understanding. It revealed the depth of the Queen's emotional intelligence, her ability to see beyond titles and public roles, her willingness to place her most personal trust in someone who had never asked for it. And Sophie, by finally breaking her silence, ensured that the Queen's voice would not be lost beneath speculation. But even as Sophie spoke, she knew the true significance of the Queen's decision extended far beyond that moment of revelation. It was not just about what had been given, it was about what would now be protected. Because the Queen's final decision wasn't just about the past, it was about the future she believed Sophie would help protect. Long after titles change and generations pass, some decisions remain. Not because they were public, but because they were personal. Queen Elizabeth's final gift wasn't about ceremony, it was about trust. And by choosing Sophie, she left behind more than an inheritance. She left a message about loyalty, character, and the quiet strength she believed would carry her legacy forward. In the years since that quiet decision was made, its meaning has only grown more powerful, because what Queen Elizabeth chose to entrust was never meant to exist within the boundaries of public acknowledgement. It existed beyond tradition, beyond protocol. It existed in the emotional space, where legacy becomes something far more human than institutional. And Sophie, who had never sought prominence, found herself carrying something that could not be measured in titles or defined by authority. She became the silent guardian of something invisible, yet deeply significant, the Queen's final expression of belief in who would protect not the monarchy's image, but its soul. This responsibility did not transform Sophie into someone new. Instead, it revealed who she had always been. Her loyalty had never depended on recognition. Her strength had never required validation. She continued her role with the same composure, the same humility, and the same emotional discipline that had earned the Queen's trust in the first place. She did not reference what had been given. She did not allow it to reshape her public identity. But those who understood the emotional truth behind the Queen's decision began to see her differently, not as someone elevated above others, but as someone entrusted with preserving something irreplaceable. Because the Queen's final act was not about reshaping hierarchy, it was about preserving meaning. She understood that the monarchy's survival depended not only on continuity, but on emotional authenticity. She knew that the crown, for all its symbolism, was ultimately carried forward by individuals whose character defined its purpose. And in Sophie, she saw that character clearly. She saw someone who would never exploit what she had been given, someone who would protect it with quiet dignity, someone who understood that true legacy is not displayed, it is protected. Over time, history itself would begin to reinterpret Sophie's place within the monarchy's story, not as someone who sought influence, but as someone who was chosen because she never did. Her quiet role, once overlooked, would take on deeper meaning. It would stand as a reminder that the Queen's final judgment was not shaped by expectation, but by emotional truth. That loyalty, when proven consistently and without ambition, becomes something far more powerful than authority. And that trust, once given, becomes a permanent part of legacy. For Sophie, this reality carried both honor and burden, because protecting something so deeply personal meant accepting that much of its meaning would remain unspoken. It meant allowing others to speculate without correction. It meant living with the knowledge that the Queen had seen something in her that could never be explained publicly. But Sophie never resisted that burden. She accepted it fully because she understood what it represented. It was not ownership, it was responsibility. It was not elevation, it was preservation. And perhaps that is where the true power of the Queen's decision lives, not in what was given, but in why it was given. It was an act of emotional clarity at the end of a lifetime defined by duty, a final affirmation of belief in someone whose loyalty had never faltered. And through Sophie, that belief continues to exist not as a public declaration, but as a private truth that continues to shape the monarchy's emotional foundation in ways few will ever fully understand. Because in the end, it wasn't the crown that defined the Queen's final choice. It was the person she trusted to protect what the crown truly meant. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.